Chapter 2: Intergenerational Trauma and Canada's Colonial History.
Before we begin, please note that the following words you see on the presentation will be mentioned throughout. Please enjoy. Now, let's begin with what trauma means. Trauma is a reaction or a result of an event that drastically disturbs the emotional well-being of a person, creating life-lasting consequences or effects. Trauma is something all people in the world face, from minor trauma such as being stung by a bee, which could cause the person to be scared of bees, to major trauma such as physical or sexual abuse, which has life-changing consequences.
We start by asking, what is intergenerational trauma? Intergenerational means something occurring across generations, while intergenerational trauma is when trauma is passed down from families.
First, what is trauma? Trauma is the response one has after experiencing a traumatic and/or severe event or experience. Some examples of traumatic experiences include any kind of abuse, especially in youth, experiencing war or genocide, and any other experience that can drastically impact a person's mental health. It is believed that trauma affects genetic processes, leading to traumatic reactivity being heightened in populations who experience a great deal of trauma. Meaning trauma changes how your genes can work by turning certain things on or off. Then those changes pass down to your children and can last for up to 5 or 6 generations. Emotional wounds, especially ones passed down through generations, can shape how we act, feel, and connect with others. The effects can appear in physical and mental forms, and they can continue to impact future generations through anxiety, depression, heart disease, PTSD, and more, as one is more perceptive to trauma if they have generational trauma. A very common example is struggling with trust in romantic relationships. If a parent experiences their parent's divorce, they may have a fear of trust in relationships, and you witnessing this may lead you to have the same fear, causing you to avoid this type of connection altogether. Unfortunately, there is no test to diagnose generational trauma. A healthcare provider can use a mental health screening to check for mental illnesses if your family has a history of trauma. There are trauma-informed interventions and therapy treatments that help people cope with their symptoms and further understand the impact of intergenerational trauma, and equip themselves with tools to help change the patterns in their DNA and help themselves and generations after.
So why does intergenerational trauma affect Indigenous peoples? The Indigenous peoples of Canada were subjected to colonization. This led to the ultimate act of trying to eliminate all Indians by killing them with diseases and starving them by killing their source of food. When that did not work, the government-funded, church-run, government-funded schools that were created to assimilate Indigenous peoples to Canadian society while simultaneously eliminating their culture. Residential schools are known as an act of cultural genocide. The Canadian colonial system was studied by Hitler and inspired the final solution. These words were used to describe the Indian problem by the Canadian government and then repeated by the Nazis when unleashing the Holocaust. So how does intergenerational trauma affect Indigenous peoples? When Indigenous children were stolen from their homes by the Canadian RCMP, they were subjected to psychological, spiritual, physical, and sexual abuse at the hands of their new care providers, the priests and nuns that worked in these schools. The children suffered these abuses from ages as early as 3 years up until they aged out at 18 years old. This led to all the survivors being left with low self-esteem, anger, depression, PTSD, suicidal thoughts, anxiety, and substance abuse. When attending residential schools, children were taught how to act, love, and care for themselves and others. The teachers used control, punishment, and coercion to receive the results they wanted. When the children aged out of the system and were brought back home to live their lives and start their families of their own, they only knew control, punishment, and coercion, and that led to high rates of family violence, domestic violence, and a large amount of child welfare cases. Today's generation, the grandchildren of residential school survivors, are left with anger, loneliness, isolation, and hopelessness. Real-life applications of trauma in Canada's colonial history. I'm going to start by talking about Indian status in Canada, the definitions, myths, and eligibility, how the definition of a status Indian has changed throughout the years, the myths that a lot of Canadians have regarding Indian status, and the colonial eligibility of Indigenous peoples of Canada. So what is Indian status? The Constitution Act, Section 35, defines 3 groups of people: Indians, Inuits, and Métis. Indians refers to First Nation peoples or Indigenous peoples of Canada, and not all people who fit into this category are considered a status Indian. In order to be a status Indian, you must fit into the criteria that was created in the Indian Act. The Indian Act is the primary law that the federal government uses when administering Indian status, First Nation governments, and reserve land management. Although status Indians may be eligible for benefits, rights, and programs from the federal and provincial government, they must first be on the Indian Register, a list maintained by the federal government that includes all personal information. So now we know that the term Indian status is defined by the Indian Act. The term Indian is also a term that is now considered outdated and offensive, but is still used in Canada's laws. In Canada, there were ways to remove the status from an Indigenous person. This is called enfranchisement, a process that results in a person no longer being considered an Indian. This meant removing them from their ban list, and therefore removing any of the benefits that were associated to being a status Indian. There were 3 ways an Indian could be enfranchised. The first way being if an Indigenous woman marries a non-Indigenous man. Any children of the woman would be relinquished of their status. However, if an Indigenous man married a non-Indigenous woman, she would be given status as well as any of her children. The second way would be to get a university degree. To get a degree and a job in the medical or legal field meant that you were fit and civilized and no longer could be considered a status Indian. The third and last way was by submitting an application. Some Indigenous peoples wanted to be considered regular Canadians. To be able to vote, work, and own property, you had to relinquish your status. The next thing I want to quickly talk about is some common myths revolving around Indian status in Canada. The first being that all Indigenous peoples have status. Inuit and Métis people do not have status, as well as any Indian who does not meet the criteria. Another common myth is that we don't have to pay taxes, but only those who live on reserves do not pay taxes on personal or real property, and if you work on reserve, you do not need to pay the federal taxes on employment income. The last common myth that I want to discuss is that education is free. Reserves do get a certain amount of funding each year depending on the population and the funding reports, but not all students get to attend school because it's simply just not enough money to send everybody. The last thing I want to talk about in regards to Indian status in Canada is the eligibility. The Canadian government continues to determine who is considered a status Indian, with the eligibility being focused on a person's family. This means that the Canadian government categorizes the blood quantum of an Indian and uses this method to determine whether or not they are going to be recognized as a status Indian. 6-1 refers to full-blooded status Indians, while 6-2 refers to the blood being mixed but still Indian enough to be considered a status Indian. The red is considered no status. So, if you have a 6-1 and a 6-1, you're going to get a 6-1. If you have a 6-1 and a 6-2, those children will be 6-1s. However, if a 6-1 dates a non-status person, they lose their status. This is just another method that the government uses to colonize the Indigenous peoples of Canada. The next real-world application I want to talk about is the 60s scoop, how it began, and how it's still affecting Indigenous peoples of Canada today. The 60 Scoop is the apprehension of Indigenous children from birth, from their homes, and from their communities beginning in 1951 up until the 1980s. The children were scooped without the knowledge and consent of their parents or their communities. They were placed into non-Indigenous homes across the U.S. and Canada, which began when amendments in the Indian Act gave provinces jurisdiction over Indigenous child welfare. Many of the children that were taken were placed into newspaper ads to try to get these children adopted by non-Indigenous families. After the devastating effects Indigenous peoples suffered after living through a century's worth of federal policies such as the Indian Act and residential schools, communities were faced with high rates of addictions, mental health issues, and poverty. Communities were underfunded and had no access to the necessary resources needed to help them navigate their trauma. Because of the new amendments to the Indian Act, social service agencies decided that the easiest way to deal with the child welfare issues were to begin removing children from their homes rather than providing resources and support services to families that needed them. It's estimated that more than 20,000 children were adopted out from their homes and moved into non-Indigenous homes from 1960 up until 1990. Many of these children could not look into their adoption files and were unaware of their heritage until later adulthood. Adoptees speak out about the traumas they experienced while in their new adopted homes, with majority of them having experienced the loss of their cultural teachings, as well as sexual and physical abuse at the hands of their adopted parents. This led to the adoptees feeling shame, loneliness, having low self-confidence, as well as confusions about who they are. The sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada. Before we go further on the topic of sterilization of the Indigenous woman in Canada, I want to first provide the definitions of sterilization and of eugenics. Sterilization is a permanent medical procedure that prevents pregnancy. Eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices that are aimed at improving the human population through controlled breeding. These two definitions go hand in hand in relation to the sterilization of the Indigenous women of Canada. Sterilization was forced on Indigenous peoples of Canada under the guise of eugenics, which provided the government with beliefs that the negative effects of colonialism, such as poverty and low health rates, was due to the low racial evolution in Indigenous peoples. This reinforced the view that Indigenous women were unfit to procreate and become mothers. Sterilization was legally passed in the British Columbia and Alberta laws, with 2,834 sterilizations performed on Indigenous peoples. They were the most prominent victims as they were represented as being mentally deficient, therefore giving them no say in whether they wanted to be sterilized or not. Sterilizations were also performed throughout areas of Canada where no legislations were enacted, such as Ontario. About 400 women and 1,000 men were sterilized in Ontario that we know of today. The sterilization occurred in the attempt to limit the reproduction of unfit persons throughout Canada. The sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada, whether it was done without consent or with pressured consent, is just one form of violence against the Indigenous women of Canada and another act of genocide against the Indigenous populations.
Here we talk about Grassy Narrows. This is a place affected by the mercury poison that was dumped in the waters of the Assiniboine tribe, causing everlasting damage to their communities from the industrial plants near this community. It was in the 70s to 80s in which the mercury was dumped into the waters, and since then, damage to 90% of the community has been affecting them greatly. How the poison affects the community is with feelings of numbness and physical issues, while those tending to them suffer from psychological stress, which could lead them to depression or worse, suicide. In the case of Azra Akabi Penance, she was found dead just not far from Grassy Narrows in 2015, and it was believed she died from the stress of the situation as her brother died from poison of last year, although no one really knows how she died and it's still a mystery to how she did.
Current research. The Canadian Institute of Health Research has what they call a strategic plan 2022 to 2026. During these years, they want to give children a better start at life, assisting with conception where necessary, along with the best health care for the parents-to-be. During childhood, participants will have everything they need to lead happy and healthy lives. As youth, they will take charge of their lives and be provided many opportunities with which to decide their path in life. By creating a team of various researchers and disciplines from a variety of fields, both here in Canada and internationally, they will use a life cycle approach to encourage participants to use their strengths and increase options for their future. Working together, researchers will create lasting relationships for future projects. Participants will be able to see and experience the difference a happy and healthy lifestyle creates.
So my part for this project is the real-world application regarding the intergenerational trauma in Canada. So throughout Canada's history, the subject on intergenerational trauma has been and will continue to be prevalent within the present and the future. So the first thing is mental health services. So cultural approaches. So mental health services can incorporate traditional healing methods such as sweat lodges, talking circles, and ceremonies, which resonate more with the Indigenous clients. So this blend of traditional and Western practices create a holistic approach to mental health wellness. So mental health professionals can undergo training in cultural competence and trauma-informed care, helping them understand the specific challenges faced by Indigenous peoples, including the effects of residential schools and mental health. Programs. So establishing community-led mental health initiatives ensures the services are tailored to the unique needs of Indigenous communities, fostering a sense of trust and cultural relevance. So, education. So, curriculum development or changes in curriculum. So, schools can develop curriculum that includes Indigenous histories, cultures, and perspectives, particularly the impacts of colonization in residential schools. For example, in the York Catholic District School Board, they have implemented that the grade 11 content will strictly be based on Indigenous peoples. So, exchange programs. Schools can facilitate programs that promote cultural exchanges and partnerships with Indigenous communities, allowing students to engage directly with the Indigenous knowledge system. And lastly, support and educating oneself. So, implementing mentorship programs and support systems within educational institutions can help Indigenous students navigate systemic barriers by fostering a sense of belonging and cultural pride. Social services, trauma-informed care. The Child Welfare Services can adopt trauma-informed practices that acknowledge the historical and ongoing impacts of the trauma of the Indigenous families, such as the 60 Scoop. This approach ensures that the services are respectful and sensitive to cultural contexts. Family preservation. Prioritizing family preservation and community-based solutions rather than removing children from their homes can help mitigate the effects of trauma in families and strengthen community ties. And collaborations with Indigenous leaders. Engaging Indigenous leaders in the design and implementation of social service programs ensures that they are culturally relevant and responsive to the needs of the community. And last but not least, policy and inclusiveness, so land acknowledgement and resource rights. Advocating for the recognition in land rights and resource management by Indigenous communities can address the historical injustices and support healing through connection to traditional lands. Self-governance. Supporting initiatives that promote Indigenous self-governance allows community to create policy and practices that reflect on their cultural values and address the specific impacts of the intergenerational trauma. Last but not least is repetitive measures. So encouraging the government accountability through repetitive policies, including financial competency, educational opportunities, and health resources, can help the legacies of colonialism and promote healing. So by focusing on these 4 areas, the stakeholders could create comprehensive and support frameworks that address intergenerational trauma, ultimately contributing to the healing and the resilience of the Indigenous peoples in Canada.
This topic is very relevant to me as I am a part of the statistics. I am a certified social worker who lives on an Indigenous reserve and serves Indigenous families. I see the struggles my clients go through every day due to intergenerational trauma, and I see how the government fails the Indigenous population year after year. My grandparents went to residential school and witnessed horrors I couldn't imagine possible at such a young age. My grandmother was sterilized in the school and witnessed her friend get raped by a priest as the nuns held her down. My other grandmother would dress the newborn babies born in the schools from rape in beautiful clothing and watched as they were burnt alive. The smell of burning flesh still haunts her to this day. As a mother, I work every day to break the cycle of abuse so my children don't have to. I am a statistic.
This is relevant to me because I want to help people in a way I know I can. At first, I wanted to be a doctor, but I realized I wasn't cut out to be one. Plus, I'm not good with blood. So I turned my eyes into helping people with their mental issues. I find how people act interesting for the most part, and I made an educated guess based on the environments I found myself in is that therapy is something that will be needed in the future for the people who are going to become adults and the kids who the current generation will nurse. And so I chose the route of psychology to gain skills to properly help those who are going to need it in the future.
As someone who wants to become a future therapist, I must have a thorough understanding of intergenerational trauma, especially when dealing with Indigenous communities or others who have experienced comparable trauma. Understanding the long-lasting effects of trauma can guide my approach as a therapist and help them deliver the best results. Additionally, as for other therapists, many could include these practices into their work by being aware of the community healing projects and efforts to revive the cultures. It highlights how crucial it is to address cultural identity and collective experiences in addition to individual rehabilitation. In the end, a therapist who adopts a holistic viewpoint can help their clients recover fully and develop resilient and self-determination.